Thank you. It's good to be here. My day job is pediatric intensive care, and I could do a 3-hour talk on how much we need the help of AI. We've been trying to get there, and been two more comments, and two more lead-ins. And as long as baseball's been here, and we've heard about the Nats, and we've heard about the Red Sox. I am a Cubs fan, so we have now heard about all three teams that broke their 100-year droughts. And my goal here is to actually be a little on the controversial side. I get it, there were no questions about the overview, but we're going to have questions here. I was brought in as the curmudgeon. So peril is the last word, and this is really where I want to focus. And again, if I had another 3 hours, we could go through half of the history of AI. Most people will look at Norbert Wiener and in the cybernetics as the place where all this began, and we'll throw up a picture of his control loop soon. But the real birth date of AI is here, and you're not going to be able to read this, but this is from this is the paper that launched the Dartmouth conference. That got all these guys together. And to go through the names, there's stories beyond stories in this group. But artificial intelligence was born in the 50s in this Dartmouth conference. And we could go through all sorts of stories of those individuals. This, though, is a paper out of MIT, again from March 1960, Licklider. And it actually gets to the point that's been mentioned a couple of times, even in Abraham's talk up front, about the need for human-computer symbiosis. I get it, this is from the 60s, it's man-computer symbiosis. But it's human-computer symbiosis, it's physician. Abraham talked about the patient, physician dyad. We actually need to make that a triad now if we're going to be successful. And it's a patient, physician, and computer triad. But I wanted to bring out one quote here. Again, this is March 1960. And what Licklider writes is, the hope is that in not too many years, so we're getting there. And this is where my curmudgeon part comes in. But the hope is that in not too many years, human brains and computing machines will be coupled together very tightly, and that the resulting partnership will think as no human brain has ever thought, and process data in a way not approached by the information handling machines as we know them now. And this we can bring Stead's work back in. This is again, this is 60 years ago, and so the question is, why now? Why will AI be successful now? And I'm not going to address that yet. I'm going to hope, as we've got time, we can jump into the audience. But actually, this is a graph that is I've modified, and the attestation's there at the bottom of the slide, a blog post. And we've been through this before. So the Dartmouth conference was in the 50s. AI got a bit of government funding in the 60s. It took off and then crashed. So AI went to. So most people will take this graph and decide that we've been through AI winter number 1. We've been through AI winter number 2. The GeoFAI is good old-fashioned AI. And that was pushed in the first boom. The second boom is the one that people my age know the best, and this is the expert systems. This is Bill Stead's work, Robert Greenis, Octo Barnett, Meisen, internist. We were going to be able to sit down at a screen, and type in the symptoms, and it was going to spit back everything we needed to know. That kind of sounds like Watson, so we can use Watson and decide that Watson was coming up in the 2010s, and the hype was more than the delivery, at least as of this moment in time. So, please go back. Anybody recognize this picture, single frame from a movie from, let me go back in time, from 1968. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to make the, can I make the, yes, thanks. Oh, so the sound's not there, but that's open the pod bay door, Hal. And the answer is no. And the reason the answer is, so why would Hal not open the pod bay door? Two reasons. And one is Hal knew because the helmet that the guy was supposed to have on in the pod is up on the machine right above Hal's brain. So we knew there was no way he was going to get back in. But this is the dystopian. This was in 1968. It was printed. It was released in '68. So it had to have been conceived in '62, '63, '64, at the height of AI, and already people are beginning to jump on the hype. The reason Hal wouldn't open the pod bay door was because he knew that when Dave came back in, he was going to shut the whole thing down. How did he know? Because he was able to lip read, not because Dave typed anything into a machine. So again, so in the public's eye, even in the '60s, AI had a very bad name. Now, it's one of the so we were tasked with Edmund Jackson and I was to write a chapter on all the rest of the AI outside of medicine, which again there are blogs that you can go all over the internet and find more information than we wrote. But we picked out a couple of places where we thought it was extremely important, and this comes out of science. And the question is, when is it safe enough? And the interesting thing about this picture, this is a paper from December 2017. There were a couple of them in Science. What is maybe hard to see, the first frame is obviously a woman in a crosswalk who's paying no attention to the fact that there's no driver in the car. But there really is a driver. There really is a driver in the car, because what you can see is the guy in the middle frame is there, and he's put a fake seat on. So he can go see so he can get the pedestrians' reactions. Now, so let me talk here for a second, because and you all know that a woman was killed a couple of years ago by one of these cars in Arizona. The lay press is reporting now that the NTSB report will be out in a couple of weeks. The preliminary results from the NTSB report was that the car saw, this is a woman walking a bike at night across the street. The car saw the woman, and because to make the car run, there's a 1 second delay between when it finds an object it needs to brake for and when it really starts to brake. The challenge here was the car was confused, and within each 1 second time frame, it reclassified this object as something else, reset the clock. So by the time it finally got to the point where it said, "I need to stop the brakes," the woman had already been hit. And the other dilemma was that, unlike this picture, the woman was jaywalking, which, having grown up in Boston, is the only way to get across the street. But again, so if there's no driver, maybe jaywalking is not the right thing to do. The point, though, again, to do the curmudgeon peril piece is as we develop these systems, and we're going to need to be extremely cognizant of the downside. On the positive side, they really are going to come. And this is, again, the goal here is to provoke a conversation. I'm assuming this is a judge. And yes, AI. So AI has gotten into law. AI has clearly gotten into music. There are people who say it's running music into the ground because if you train an algorithm to predict what we all like, we're going to be stuck in this same loop over and over and over again for a long time. And the analogy into healthcare is, if we use AI to predict what we did in a retrospective data set, even in 2015, and we repeat that over and over again, it's going to be very difficult, in fact, to break out of that. And the last thing we want is to be stuck in 2015. AI in the stock market, if anybody owns a stock or a mutual fund, we have entrusted our lives to those machines, or at least our financial life. And this is going to go all the way back to Norbert Wiener. This is his original, one of his original feedback loops, and it's the little, whatever. We've got a tribesman in a hotel, but whatever. And it goes through how this person responds to a fire. But again, so for the 50s are back, and the reinforcement learning algorithms that I believe are going to be the way we need to take the world forward here are clearly simply even a simplification of what Norbert Wiener was talking about, again, 50 or 60 years ago. So in my view, so the curmudgeon part of me says we've got to be really careful. There are a lot of mistakes, there's a lot of pitfalls, but the optimist in me, and I really am an optimist, the optimist in me says this particular slide is the only way, and it's the crucial way, to make this particular vision work. We need to be learning, and again, this is Stead's 50-year-old 50-year-old concept. We need data on all the patients, and we need to learn from all the patients, and the clinical data that we've got needs to be the driver for all the reinforcement learning that we do. Now, I'm going to end on a controversial comment, and I should say I'm from Hopkins. I'm speaking as an individual. This isn't institutional policy. But it is my belief, and Nancy Cass and Ruth Fadden are both colleagues, it is my belief that to make this learning healthcare system a reality, to bring AI, to bring the reinforcement learning piece in, to take Bill Stead's concept from 50 years ago and really make it work, that we have the moral obligation that as an institution, not only to collect the data, but also to use what's learned and to inform and improve care delivery. So on some level, taking the history of AI and not wanting to fall into winter 3. I have hidden the way this author drew the rest of the graph. So my plea is that we not fall into winter 3. And I would be curious to open it up for discussion to find out, to start the discussion on what we need to do to stay out of winter 3. The goal is to not repeat the past. It's been done twice. You make the same mistake 3 times, and that's just the wrong answer. So I'm happy. I would love pushback. I would love comments. And the question is, how do we stay out of winter number 3?
Thank you very much, Jim. And I believe there are 2 microphones that are going to be, you can actually toss across the room. Just try not to hit each other in the head. But if you have a question, please raise your hand and we can get you a microphone so you can ask your question.
If you have a question, raise your hand and Talia over there will throw the microphone to you.
Yeah.
Good morning, and thank you very much. The question here is a 3-part question. It's why do we need AI in health? What are the goals of AI? And what can AI do that humans cannot do?
Well, so again, I began with the comment that I do peds intensive care for a living, and I've got when I'm doing patient care, there are 40 kids in the ICU that we've got. The number of data elements coming from each one of those kids is 350. It's the streaming data elements, and if you go down the flow sheet, there are 350 rows. Some of the data are right, some of the data are wrong, some of it is coming at 240 hertz, some of it is coming once every other month, and we do okay. And then there's, even from one of the original guys, there's the data that shows there's a classic paper called The Human Ability, the Human Limits on Cognition. The magic number is 7 plus or minus 2. And we can handle 7 things at once. And if what you're going to have for lunch is on the list, you're down to 6. And that's on some level it's a well-proved point. But we chunk information. So I can look at a face and there's 150 data elements from each face, and so we can chunk and humans will create we are pattern recognition machines, and we can handle seven of them at once. If we train a lot, we can handle 12 or 13. But again, I've got 40 kids in the ICU, so it's a long lead up to the answer to the question. We are brilliant. An experienced clinician is really good at pattern recognition. But where AI will help is it's going to find patterns in the data that I can't yet see, because I have neither the ability to see the minute stuff or the cognitive ability to handle the entire flood of data that I'm supposed to be able to. And the other sequence I use in slides is Star Wars, which is also 40 years ago. Luke blew up the Death Star, and we're here trying to keep people alive, and the rumor is 12 million people died when the Death Star blew up, but the rebellion, it's all good. Skywalker got into the crevice on the Death Star completely not completely, but with a tremendous amount of automated help. There was a mainframe up in the Rebel base. They had their maps that they stole. That was all put into the GPS. R2-D2 was blowing folks up, sent Darth Vader off into the next movie. But when he had to do it, and this is the really crucial piece, when he blew the Death Star up by hand, that was the Force. So again, I view AI, and again, the question of why we need AI. We need AI to get us to the point where we can do novel things, where we're not stuck in the loop from 2015, where we can look at a kid or an adult, whatever. We can look at a patient and say, I think the machine is wrong. we're going to try this. But until we do that, and until we collect the data, and until they feed the data back to me that says, Jim, you were right, or no, that was a mistake, let's not do that one again. Until we've got AI doing the patterns and letting me work symbiotically with the machine and then analyze each one of the results, we're living in the past. And AI has the promise of being able to do all that, as I suspect we'll hear over the course of the rest of the day. I'm sorry, long answer to a simple question.
As a point of order, I want to interject. When you ask your first question of the day, if you wouldn't mind just stating your name and your affiliation or where you're working, that would be appreciated.
We have another question over here.
My name is Tariq Ahmad. I'm from the VA Hospital in Mather, California, Pain Clinic. Thank you.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you. I'm Bryant Lin. I'm on the clinical faculty in internal medicine here. I was at MIT as an undergraduate and a graduate student in AA Winter #2, so I can give a little bit of my personal perspective.
Right,
I
good.
think I remember in those days, I also was I don't know if you're familiar with the MIMIC database for critical care. I was the undergraduate programmer for the MIMIC2 database clinical side. And I think the biggest differences I see that will hopefully prevent, and I love your response to this, AI Winter 3 is the democratization of data, plus the democratization of tools. I remember back in the day, it was a huge pull to, do any sort of neural network work, any sort of machine learning. I was sitting on MATLAB, beg borrowing, using numerical recipes in C. And then getting data was very difficult. Now, a few weeks ago, I downloaded all of PubMed to my laptop, which is incredible. So that's my comment to your question. Yeah, I don't know, would love to get a response.
So, the optimist, nicely done, and with Mimic in particular. So for people who don't know that, it's a publicly available data set from three of the adult intensive care units out of the hospitals in Boston. All sorts, millions of patients at this point. And frankly, there are hundreds of papers that have been published based on the Mimic data, and because, as you've just said, the tools are now, the tools to extract the data are on GitHub. There are going to be more and more and more of them. So the optimistic part of me says, you're absolutely right. And what STED didn't have, what Octobarnet didn't have, was the machines that we've got, and frankly, the languages, the computer languages we've got to do all the stuff that they envisioned were going to come. And I'm going to, one more plug though from my last slide, because if we need to start doing this prospectively. And again, I do peds intensive care. I'm a sepsis person, as lots of folks are. And one of the goals of AI is to predict, as we heard at the beginning, to predict a condition before I can see it as a human. We've got to be very careful, though, when we're predicting these conditions from these retrospective data sets. Because the retrospective data sets, if you hone your algorithm to what we did 10 years ago, we're going to do a brilliant job of 10 years ago. The challenge really is the learning healthcare, where we're taking the Mimic tools and using them all prospectively. So there's both peril in what's been done, but the tools we've created and the promise that will come out of this is really rather extraordinary. We got a question here. I don't know how much time we have. I could do this for hours.
Newton Chan, prenatal diagnostics. I would like to call assistive intelligence, where human and machines collaborate, and there will be a learning loops between human and machine. Do you think there will always be a human domain expertise as curator? And as far as data, federated machine learning can safeguard data within the institution that collaborates in making recursive machine learning?
So I'm actually happy to have other people jump in and answer these questions too. The question, so there were a couple of parts there, and I think, and one of them is making the data available. And I do believe there are ways. So one of the differences, again, and we made this in the chapter, and one of the advantages that the autonomous car folks have is the data is really available, and they've got maps, they send folks out, they've got the sensors, and although there is a lot of personal information that gets collected there, it's not as sensitive as is healthcare information. And we all as individuals need the right to be able to protect our data, and we need to know that our data is being used for our own good. But again, and one of the points that Cass and Fadden will make is the need to have healthcare data viewed as a public good, and with all the safety and privacy concerns addressed, the healthcare data will need to be a public good. In my opinion, again, I'm not speaking for the institution, any institution. The other question on the human computer piece, somebody mentioned it this morning. The people who will be out of jobs are not the radiologists, but they'll be the radiologists that don't understand how to use the AI all at the same time. And it's just the way the world's going to go. Go ahead.
Daniel Kaplan, retired professor at Stanford. I'm very concerned about the racial bias in our healthcare system. It's been well demonstrated, and recent publications have shown that AI can actually propagate the same bias. How do we address this issue so that we don't make the same biased decisions that the data that we're using in our AI system is currently doing?
Right, so the question is about the biases. So bias, there's an interesting paper out of Boston on the positive side of bias. Zach Kohani and colleagues went into their outpatient data and they made an effort to predict 30-day mortality. And they did a great job. They had millions of points, and so it all worked. But then they said, so rather than looking at the hemoglobin or the serum lactate, rather than looking at the value, they said, well, let's just look at the metadata. And if you had a serum lactate drawn at 1 a.m., you're going to die. If you had a hemoglobin drawn at 4 in the afternoon on a Thursday, that predicted death because that's when oncology's hospice folks were in. So the title of the paper was Bias in the Data, and in fact, in my mind, that was good bias because that brought into the data mix the systems approaches and the medical knowledge that if a clinician says you need a lactate at 1 in the morning, you're going to be sick. So bias can be good, and I agree with you, and I've said this a couple of times now. I know the bias can be really bad if you're going to train your data retrospectively. And we can do that. We can write the papers. We can hone the techniques. But if we're going to make AI work, if we're going to avoid, so winter number 3 could come because we all go to market with these algorithms that were based on data that stopped being collected 10 years ago. We need to go into this with our eyes wide open, collect the data as prospectively as collect the data prospectively, annotate the data prospectively, get a little uncomfortable with ourselves, because we as clinicians we've got to make dichotomous decisions. You either treat or you don't. But we've got to have to get comfortable with ourselves and question ourselves. Not to the point we can't make a decision, but to be able to annotate the data prospectively enough to be able to train the algorithms on a race, to use race as the marker based on a racial annotation that frankly takes into the ambiguity of even what race is. So I think it has to all be done prospectively.
I think I'd like to ask, I really think there's three key issues there. There's sort of vigilance, transparency, and then education around how to use the data. So, there's issues around making data representative for the population that you're trying to apply it to, and if you're always cognizant of that, and you're teaching the users and the implementers that's extremely important, and then maintaining, as you mentioned, Jim, sort of vigilance of the data over time, because the data itself are going to change, and if you're not allowing the algorithm to change with that data, then you're stuck in the past. And lastly is transparency. So how is a clinical system or clinical users supposed to evaluate a tool if they don't understand the characteristics that went into its development, evolution, and maintenance? So that's data transparency, that's performance transparency, that's a number of pieces to that. So I think that's an excellent question.
Yeah, and I just want to add, so this topic comes up throughout the publication, and I think you're going to hear it reiterated over the course of the presentations throughout the day.
Right, and I'm going to go back to the Star Wars thing. Skywalker knew what the machine couldn't do, and that's the transparency piece. We are all going to need to be trained on knowing what the machine can't do. Sorry, I like Star Wars.
Hi. This is
Any
Hema
other
Cham-
questions, please?
This is Hema Chamraj
Oh,
from
sorry.
Intel.
Go ahead.
So your question is pretty intriguing, the AI winter. And from a technologist perspective, obviously we have a lot of optimism in terms of the kind of compute that we didn't have in winter 2 or winter 1, and the tools that we have developed, and also somebody brought up the sensitivity of the data itself as an issue where we can bring in federated learning, where the data doesn't have to move beyond the premises of the hospital. So we can do a lot of things, but that was me being an optimist and being in the technology area. But I wonder again, how can we get to the data that is the requirement for AI? If it's all going to be in silos and it's not going to be shared, and if you're talking about prospective data, not just retrospective, so how do we get to a point where the data can be really shared? And you talked about public good, but should we really move the discussion towards the patient's rights for the data, and would we make progress by kind of moving this discussion towards the patient owning the data and making the call on whether it can be shared? And would we make more progress that way than how we are today? Because the technology can help, but I think this may be a bigger issue in terms of data itself, and I would like your insights.
So the simple answer to the question is yes. We need access to the data. And there have been, I have no idea in the audience here how many people we have that are representatives of patient advocacy groups. But there are a number of patient advocacy groups that are focused on narrow diseases, because that's what they do. But they've amongst themselves all gotten together and shared data and given it to the researchers, because they as patients, we all have patients. In my view, we all as patients have a vested interest in making sure our data gets analyzed correctly. I can't remember if we put this in the chapter or not, but a plug for Patients Like Me, which began as it's a non-for-profit that's now been bought by Optum, I think. But again, thousands of patients, hundreds of thousands of patients putting their own data in, and letting the ML universe take a look at those. At some level, we've just got to get over it. And Hopkins is beginning to get there. We've got a precision medicine initiative where the data is becoming available to the clinicians. Stanford has the same thing. Michigan has got the same thing. And I think we just need to continue to push. That all by itself is I've dropped 100 controversial lines here. But again, the data's here, and the data's available. We just need to start to get at it.
Yeah, and so I think we in Chapter 1, we also talk about some of the issues around data standardization and sharing, and a lot of the various efforts underway in the United States to improve sharing. We also talk about issues around data ownership and control, and what kind of frameworks we should be thinking about when we're thinking about who actually owns the data and who should be controlling the way that various data sets are used. And I don't know, Michael, if you want to add anything, because I know that was your part of that chapter.
Yeah, certainly one of the limitations of AI right now is that the data are so fragmented and have sort of bias in sort of how the sampling is. So I think, as data are aggregated across more situations, and as patients themselves, like you see initiatives now where patients sign up for a service where they aggregate all of their data into a central repository, and then they allow reuse of that for research or other operational purposes or for their own personal care. And so I think there's going to be an evolution of how the data are made available and governed. And I think Chapter 1 does deal with some of that.
Yeah. And we're seeing various federal efforts. So there's various proposed data blocking rules from the Office of the National Coordinator and from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. At the National Academy of Medicine, there's also an ongoing project to engage various stakeholder groups in discussions about data sharing, and to identify what some of the barriers are and what some of the short-term solutions are that we can begin to implement over the next 2 to 3 years. So we'll actually be having another publication out on that topic early next year. One thing I'll also add is when we actually started the working group and had some of our earlier conversations, the working group really did want to get into the issues of data sharing to a large extent, but because that is a publication in and of itself, we had to kind of narrow the scope of the conversation around that particular issue to make this publication somewhat reasonable.
But again, the groundwork for all this discussion is laid out in these two books. The cartoon that Robert showed this morning about the patient who came in and wanted his iPhone listed as his primary doc. My hope is that this will be consumer-driven as much as it is us on the front line saying we have to have the data. And when someone comes to me and says, what do you mean you haven't run the algorithm? Then we'll know we've gotten there. But we just need to continue to push.
I guess my last comment on that, I didn't say it earlier, is that I do feel like the public's going to expect us to use these algorithms, but I really don't feel, I'm a part-time primary care physician myself, I don't feel like the patients are really going to want just automated care. I feel like they're going to want the collaboration between AI and the clinical team to help them decide their care plan.
And I'm with you 100% on that, 200%. And it's the goal here is the patient, physician, or clinician, take the physician out, but patient, clinician, computer triad. Please, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Gloria Principi. I'm a community member and potential patient. And my question has to do with how will you train doctors who will rely more and more on AI to continue that trust, to build on that trust with the patient. I don't want a doctor who is going to be deciding all of my care based on an algorithm. how do you train them in medical school? How do you train them afterwards? And I realize you have a lot of experience, but what about new doctors? What is going to happen on that front to make sure that you can continue to build that trust and you don't have doctors relying entirely on what's on the computer screen?
Can you just hand the microphone to the man in front of you? I'm going to beg off on that one. I don't know. And I worry about that too. And it's on the list of reasons, I think, why we're in the hole that we're in. And it's because what I want to know is if 30 years ago the 60-somethings complained about me as much as I complain about the 30-somethings now. I suspect the answer is yes, right. But one of the challenges we have is exactly it's a big deal. It's because we're training. The next group is coming in, and they're being trained the same way I was trained, the same techniques. So I think we could be a generation away from making this as good as it needs to be. But again, I've not given the medical education piece any thought at all.
The good news is that the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine have a work group on health education that are actually looking at this specific issue. And I think it's important to teach clinicians. As the rise of evidence-based medicine and sort of teaching around diagnostics and how to critically evaluate tools, whether it's a lab test, whether it's a radiology test, whether it's an EKG or whether it's artificial intelligence. Learning how to critically interpret and use those tools, I think, is critical for clinicians to learn. So I think your point is well taken, and I think the health education field is aware and trying to wrestle. These issues have just sort of emerged so rapidly and so strongly that everyone's still trying to get their heads around the pieces that are needed in order to address this.
And the optimist in me would say that even the people, the kids that are now interns and residents, their expectations of what technology can do are completely different than what mine were. So potentially when they are 60-something, this current group, let me be optimistic, this current group can be the one that can help make that transition. But it's not going to be as night and day as it was between the mobile phone and between the Motorola flip phone and the iPhone. It's not going to be as cut and dry as your car could change lanes all by itself, and 3 years ago it couldn't. It's going to be painfully gradual, I think. I think we're now between us and a break.
Yes, us and a break in. I'd like to add that the group that Michael mentioned, there's a group out of NASM, some of whom are in the audience today, to Gloria's question, where we talked about what needs to happen for professional health education. So these are community health workers, physicians, other clinicians, other people on the clinical team, patients, and what have you. And we were talking about how so much of the technology that's come into healthcare did not get included into the curriculum. So for instance, the electronic health record, we have two colleagues here at Stanford who chose to create a class called an elective, and they have a better name, they have a different name for it. My name for it is that teaches trainees how to biopsy the electronic health record. So the clinician is not spending their entire time looking at the clinical health record, but instead is figuring out that which they need from there and how to engage with the patient and solve the problem that's at hand. What we also talked about in the meeting that Michael was referring to last night, this group from NASM and a group of us got together, and we're getting together again tonight, is the fact that if you're going to live in a world of augmented intelligence, where you have AI tools, just like you have lab tests, just like you have genetic testing, just like patients walk in with all the data on their phones and their watches and what have you, and their rings. Let's start with the patient. Let's ask, what is the patient's problem? Not the anatomy of the body, but the patient is presenting a problem. I have a shoulder pain. And how do you approach that shoulder pain with the new 21st century toolbox at the bedside, which includes the anatomy and everything else you knew from before and has been part of medical education for a long time, to AI tools, to genetic data and what have you, enough such that the clinician at that front line knows what the tools are, what can they be used for, what they should not be used for, and when they need to go get a consult, whether it's an AI consult or a genetics consult or a radiology consult. Some of us, under the tutelage of Abraham, have been teaching a 2-day course, and we just had our 5th annual one last weekend about teaching at the bedside. And what we're doing is teaching everything to physician educators so they can go back to their communities and teach again on everything from how do you do the physical exam to how do you use ultrasound at the bedside and everything in the middle. And over time, we will add curricula on how do you use AI tools or other tools at the bedside as well.
Good.
So,
Yeah.
thank you, Jim. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks,
Thank you, Danielle. Please join me in thanking them.